Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm here today with Dr. Pamela Crossley. Dr. Crossley is a specialist on the Qing Empire and modern Chinese history, and also researches and writes on Central and Inner Asian history, global history, the history of horsemanship in Eurasia before the modern period, and the imperial sources of modern identities. She's the author of 8 books. Forthcoming is The Hammer and Anvil, Nomad Rulers at the Forge of the Modern World. And the most recent after that, I believe, is The Wobbling Pivot, China Since 1800. And Dr. Crossley, absolute pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you. It really is a pleasure to be here.
And what I wanted to ask you about today is how can we better understand China and perhaps even ourselves by understanding the history of China? Mm-hmm. Obviously, that's why you're here. That's what that's your specialty. How did you become interested in history, and how did you become interested in Chinese history?
Okay, there's a lot of questions kind of fell on top of each other there, but there's probably a way to weave them together. I'll just start with the thing about getting interested in China because it's
sure
easier. I think it was, I'm from a different period. When I was in high school, we had the Vietnam War going on. And there were a few other little connections that my family had to Asia in various ways, but I kind of conceived the idea I'd like to take a course on Vietnamese history when I went to college. But then the college I went to was too small, and they didn't have Vietnamese history. They only had Chinese history. And then you have to add on to that, just by happenstance, my earliest and best friends were students of Chinese descent from Malaysia, Hong Kong, and so on. So things just sort of, yet I was an English literature major as an undergraduate. I did a lot of history. One of my professors said, somewhere towards the end, you could go to graduate school in Chinese history. She had the idea. And, well, it worked out. So here we are. So it was actually those things that they tell you history is about, one darn thing after another. Right. Why I would stay interested in China, and particularly the period I'm doing. Well, very recently, my professor died, who was a very, very well-known historian, Jonathan Spence. And
yes.
So I just today I finished a little essay about that. He just had a way of doing history and talking about people and experience and the past that really, I wasn't the only one before or after. There's a lot of people who, on account of him, got kind of stuck in the Qing period, which just more or less means the early modern period, the time when we're on the way to where we are. And I think he had a really wonderful sense of what that kind of felt like for these people whose lives were starting to become global. So like Jesuits who were going to China, Chinese who in the 18th century, 19th century were visiting Europe. He was particularly interested in those kinds of experiences. And so that was a very, very important influence.
I have his book. Is it Modern China? It's big.
Yeah,
it's red.
That big one.
I have it downstairs.
That really big one. Good. It's a wonderful thing to have on the shelf. It's called The Search for Modern China. It's the book that you have to have if you're gonna look like you know things about China. So that was a very, very important influence there. I really think to get back to the sort of first question that you asked and to sort of tie this in, the way that you put it was very good. What can we learn about ourselves by learning about China? And actually, before we started, you also said something very important, which was that, and something that people actually tend to overlook, which is, most of human history has actually happened in China. I mean, the greater proportion, because that's where the people have been. And it is a long and continuous cultural history. So, and in fact, a long and continuous economic history. So it really is true that the history of China is fundamental to just thinking about the history of mankind. I'm going to say mankind because actually man used to, as you may know, used to be not a gendered word. So this is a really important thing to me. My profession went through a period. Can't say when it ended because for some people it hasn't ended yet, but where part of the whole approach for people, whether they were in history, political science, history of religion, philosophy, part of the whole thing was to make people think that there's something really, really special about China, and you've got to be you've got to rely, right, on these experts like me, who we've studied the language, we've been there, we know about Confucianism, and so you have to look to us for us to tell you about all the wonderful, special, unique things about China. Now, people do have to know those things. Expert knowledge is really important in every single field, but the essence of it, I think, is where you started with your questions, which is the Chinese are people like us. They're not actually some strange, exotic, weird thing that you have to know a lot of secret things about in order to understand. On the contrary, because of the just the magnitude of Chinese population, Chinese historical experience, they're the most exemplary, right, in some ways, of what's happened to humanity because, the biggest sample, right, is the most exemplary if it has the necessary characteristics of diversity and, representativeness, which China actually does. So I like where you're starting with that. And I would say that's more or less what the significance is of the study of China.
So you think that Chinese history, and I'm just clarifying here, so feel free to respond, because it is that large sample, it's probably the most representative in one nation of the history of mankind.
Yeah, if you can,
or one culture. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there are many ways to look at this. If you wanted to be reductionist, right, we could just say, well, how about this population thing? I mean, when I was in college, we were still being told the reason China is having so many problems in the 19th century is that there was a population boom, and then all of a sudden there were like all these Chinese, and you even hear people today still say the size of the population is the explanation for everything. When things are going well for China, the size of the population is the answer because it provides the, cheap labor and, great diversity of talent. When things are going badly for China, it's because of the population, because there's too many of these people. But actually, when you put it into, let's say, a global perspective, China's pattern of population growth as a general thing is simply, it has the same curve to it, right, that the global population has. So, yeah, there was a kind of population boom in China in the 18th century because there was a population boom everywhere in the 18th century. It just happens that in the case of China, you can do something with Chinese history that you couldn't do with, let's say, Belgian history. Okay, so you can look at the curve of population growth in Belgium. It's not going to look anything like the curve for the human population because it's too small, and it's not diverse enough. It doesn't have diversity of terrain. It doesn't have, it's in the temperate zone. But other than that, China has a tremendous diversity of terrain, of agricultural resources, and the probably most, this is a very striking thing that people don't tend to look at. When you look at tables, let's say you're going to open something and it had all these tables of population growth or anything, and then China will always be up there at the top. Because, in fact, China today as a political entity, right, as a shape on a map, corresponds in a real general way to China 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. But the other place that actually has a history rather similar to that would be South Asia, which today is broken into Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and so on. So you're going to look them up all separately, and you will never get the picture that you'll get by looking up China, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you mentioned it, and I had it written down as a question. What are some of the most popular misconceptions that you deal with teaching Chinese history? Obviously, this idea of blaming everything on population is something is a common one. Are there any other really popular misconceptions that people just get wrong about China all the time?
Well, blaming everything on China is a good one. The other
it's
one,
true. Yeah,
it's around. The other would be China originated everything, so that's like people, and we have people who believe both of these at the same time. I was on a podcast not too long ago in which it sort of came up towards the end that once these myths about Chinese or East Asian history they wear out with historians, right? They don't die. They go into political science and international relations where they just continue living. So Confucianism, right? Confucianism, the explanation of everything in China. No, I mean, historians would not go for this now, but it went over there. It went over there to political science and international relations. And the idea of a Chinese world order, a tributary system that's all very peaceful, and this is supposed to be historical, all peaceful, and China's at the center, and it's like the moral leader of all these other little countries revolving around it like satellites. And then you can have people in international relations right now who will actually say, this is historical, which it isn't, but because it is historical, evidently this means everybody's used to it, it's a good model for future relations in East Asia and maybe around the world, where we'll have China at the center, you know. Everybody knows that in Chinese, the name for China is the central country. So this is why, because it's going to be at the center of everything. So I think most of the myths about China, I think, tend to revolve in that sort of direction. And in recent years, we have had myths being actively promoted by the current government of China. So that doesn't exactly help to dispel the effect of some of these things. But on that point, I guess I would just add, it really is important for people, no matter what they're speaking of, they have to distinguish between China as a population, let's say, and the Chinese Communist Party, which is a very tiny portion of that population, and the government of Xi Jinping, which is even distinct in its way from the Chinese Communist Party. So people who just say China this, Beijing that, it can get to be a dead end because these are actually distinct sort of actors in contemporary history.
It'd be like... It's like when people talk about just the United States and don't take into account things like, I live in Central Florida. I used to live in Wisconsin, and I used to live in Chicago, and I used to live in New England. And every single place
is a different country.
Very different.
Yeah.
Very different.
That's right. Well, going back to your point about this all, China, just like the United States, is hundreds of distinct societies. And it's really hard to say anything, to make any sensible generalizations about them.
If you wanted someone to understand, and I understand, you always have, reductionism is really hard to do. It's really hard to stop, right? We have an hour, maybe a little over an hour worth of time here.
Right.
If you had to communicate what was most important about Chinese history, what moments would you share with somebody, or what themes, or what mix of those two things?
Wow. Um,
And if that, what are some of your favorite moments? Maybe perhaps that's the easier question,
well, this is
or maybe that's harder.
that moments thing. That's really hard. I mean, I guess the first thing that I would want to impress upon people, and I maybe I do this in my classes. I hope I do. Is that what you need to know about China is the changeability, the ways in which there have been very, very, very dramatic changes in the ancient times, in medieval times, and in modern times. And, China is, I think, one of the few countries to which people generally attach this idea of unchangingness, right? That, China, it's had the similar government for 3,000 years, and Confucianism 5,000 years. No, I mean none of this. China is changes, and I mean radical changes all the time, including within the last couple decades. So that would be the first thing I would try to kind of knock loose, right, from people's assumptions. The first thing you've got to know about China is constantly changing, and radical, deep changes in every way, economically, culturally, demographically. Moments. Well, I think one of the moments to kind of think about, because I have been writing about this very recently, was I think everybody knows about the Opium War. They know something about the Opium War. They know there was an Opium War, and that it's all caused supposedly by the fact that Britain wants to import opium into China, and the Qing Empire, which is ruling China at the time, doesn't want that. And I think one of the moments is when the Qing government sends Commissioner Lin, who's this famous figure who was given really plenipotentiary powers to go down there to Guangzhou, to the city of Canton, where the British were, and essentially make them stop importing opium. And make the Chinese merchants who were helping the British import the opium, make them stop doing that. This one guy, he came with a very small entourage and just goes in. I think that moment, you really think about, he was a very, very interesting man, very traditionally educated, and yet and he already had a long career as a kind of troubleshooter in China. A lot of problems in China already in the 1840s. And I think just that moment where he gets there, right, and he sees, he doesn't right away, but in a short period of time, he sees the British ships coming. It's a time when the British Navy is, nobody beats the British Navy.
Right.
And he's trying, this is this moment. Here's this huge empire, the Qing, that has a long history of conquest behind it. And now here we are. What are we, to just see like the future coming at you, right, with these ships, to just feel this thing that somehow I've got to stop this evil from occurring in my country. And yet, how will I do that? I mean, that sort of, I've got to make this happen, and yet I'm not sure I have the power to make this happen. And this is not a familiar feeling, right, for me as a Qing official, to think, gosh, I'm sort of helpless here. I don't know what to, and to think, is there a way? I mean, it was actually, because he was so resourceful, he really did have a lot of ideas in the immediate future after 1839, and then even a little bit later. He had a lot of ideas about how we're going to do this. He couldn't get people to listen, right? He was one of these voices crying in the wilderness. But I think that moment there, right, where you have actually a number of really amazing figures in China in the 1840s who were all on one side of this whole problem or the other, right? Opium, we're trying to get rid of it, or we're trying to sell it and become extremely wealthy. The wealthiest man in the world was a Chinese merchant living in Hong Kong at that time. I think that moment, and not for the reasons that many of my colleagues would look to it. In China, that the Opium War is the dividing line between modern and pre-modern. No, I don't think that. I don't think.
Okay.
I don't think the West had, that kind of an impact on China, actually. And I don't think it's all about, that the great issues involved there are imperialism or, opium itself. I think the great issues there are, this is one of those moments where a man is standing there, his feet on the ground, and he's looking at the future that he can't prevent, right? It really is something. I mean, nowadays we fantasize this as the asteroid that's heading for Earth and we can't divert it. It's that kind of a thing. I mean, he saw like an asteroid coming at China and couldn't divert it.
That's an incredible moment. And I think you speak to an existential state that I think some of us even start to feel with technology, even as you talk about seeing the future here. My brother just bought an Oculus. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them.
Yes.
And he's talking to me about it. He wants to bring and have me try it. And just this idea that for decades now, we have been reading science fiction about living in this virtual world. And now it's here. It's here. It's everywhere. And it's in our living rooms. And I mean, not that we necessarily would want to stop it, but I mean, how would we? Right?
Yeah.
And so I love that because it gives us that hope that we have faced these kind of existential moments, and while they have created radical and dramatic changes, we didn't end there. We didn't stop there.
Right.
And also just that sense of familiarity and recognizing that it's something we've faced before.
Right.
It's something that as a human race we have continually faced.
Right.
It's really powerful. So thank you. As I was looking through the different topics that you cover. One of the ones that really stuck out to me, a lot of your work has to do with the imperial sources of Chinese identity. What are those sources and why are they important?
Oh, well, now here we are back to your idea of all of this really being about everybody. This is very hard to summarize, but I think just to make it simple, a lot of the work I've done, and that I will be doing in the near future is really about who told us in the 20th century who we are, right?
Yeah.
So we have anthropologists who are going to tell us things like, well, we can identify groups on the basis of the language that they speak and who their ancestors are and what religion they're practicing and whether they have a homeland, things like that. In the late 20th century, historians did tend to absorb a lot of those kind of ideas about identity on the assumption that, well, if the anthropologists are looking at it, it must be like it's natural. Like people just woke up and they said, oh, yeah, you're speaking the same language as me. Well, that means we must be, we're alike, we're the same. And those other folks over there speaking this other language, they're not us. But actually, no. I mean, sooner or later you have to ask yourself, well, who said that this is what identity has to rest on, particularly national identities and so-called ethnic identities. And no, if you were to go back before, let's say, 1500, maybe 1600 in some parts of the world, people are building their identities on completely different things. Languages in the Middle Ages, you had these universal languages for the Islamic world, for the Christian world, for the Buddhist world. I mean, they had these universal languages that nobody thought that because you're speaking some little local dialect, that suddenly this is your identity, right? In the Middle Ages, aristocrats had one identity, and sort of serfs, right, had this other identity. People weren't just going around saying, "Yeah, I'm Italian." I mean, this wasn't happening. So to me, that was the question: how do you get from that kind of a situation, or even in the 21st century, when people will build identities on gender preferences or musical tastes, right? People will build, like, seriously, identities on this. That's a 21st century thing. It's very interesting. But in the 20th century, that wasn't easy to do. And in the 19th century, you couldn't do that at all. So my question was, why? And I used the Qing period as an example of how this works, right? That these great empires, the land empires of Eurasia in the 1500s, 1600s, in the course of these massive conquests, actually generated institutions of identity ascription. You got it when you were born. You might have some choices over your life about abandoning it or opposing it or internalizing it, but the criteria were already there, along with the institutions, to create, the incentive for you to sort of take this on as your identity. And those identities are the ones that were bounded by language and religion and your homeland, of course, because these are overland empires. They just spread out over people's homelands. These empires not only established these criteria of identity. I'm thinking of the Qing Empire in China, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. They not only built up these criteria, but they provided all the cultural resources in terms of histories and language primers and, everything you would need, historical geographies, so that at the end of the 19th century, when these empires are dissolving and everybody's saying, well, we're all going to be around when this empire is gone, so what are we going to base a government on?
Right.
Some of them could assume, my identity is inevitable because here it is documented. I go to the library, I show my kids the books, the maps. They understand we're going to survive any state. So the state collapses and then we are still here, right? So
Yeah.
if you're the English or the French or the Chinese, right? And this is fine. We're going to have a state based on us. They think that they're doing it in contravention of the empire. Actually, the empire gave them these criteria and told them who they are, and they have now internalized it. Now, at the same time, there are communities all over Eurasia and, in fact, Africa and the Americas at that time of people who never had identities that were supported in that way by these empires. So they go into the late 19th and early 20th centuries without the historical geographies, without the languages that have been institutionalized and standardized. And they do not have the presumption that their identities are inevitable and will survive the fall of these empires. What's going to happen to them is they're going to end up living in somebody else's state. And so, Jews in Germany or Muslims in China, this is where we're getting to this great divide, right? And nowadays we call everything ethnic, but in fact, that was what ethnic meant to people like Weber, right, in the 20th century, that it was these identities that did not have a claim to inevitability, that, in fact, were not going to become national identities. And unfortunately, in the 20th century, there was a sort of a portrayal of this by anthropologists as if this was natural. Everybody just woke up and, this is the way people think. But in fact, my studies of China, in fact, and now I've done Russia as well, looking at Ottoman, shows how this happened, how these particular criteria language
Yes.
and religion and homeland and ancestry, how those became a sort of complex of identity that was actually told to us by these empires. And it's a product of conquest. And it isn't just some natural thing that people always drift back to, if they, as you know, in the United States, we have plenty of identities, and yet we can all speak English, and that, that didn't make these identities impossible in any way. But it took us a while to get there.
One really interesting, and let me just restate this to make sure I'm tracking with you. So in a lot of ways, this inevitability per se came from the standardization of these languages, of these cultures, and in many ways that whole idea of standardization was a tool for the empire that was doing it.
Exactly.
So that they could create the empire, and that was just as important as the conquest itself.
That is exactly right, and that is so important.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because we do tend to think of ourselves in these often nationalistic or ethnic senses that are seen as just basically inevitable. You've mentioned a couple examples, but if you don't mind, is there a favorite example of yours for this kind of thing, where a particular institution that you could maybe give us a more detailed example, or maybe a story that you think really demonstrates what you're talking about?
Well, I can give you this. I mean, this is very sort of inside, right? But my own specialization in the Qing is this focus on this group called the Manchus, who are now on the internet. This is famous. I mean, there's like this huge enthusiasm for Manchu language, and everybody, people will write blogs in this. Technically, it may be a dead language. It's certainly an endangered language, but not on the internet. It's got this growing sort of. The Manchus are supposed to be the ruling group, right? Cultural group of the Qing Empire. And there are plenty of historians from the past, and in fact now, who would describe this as, this is this identity, like Mongols, that they lived out there on the frontier. They were in the woods or wherever they were, and then they burst out and they conquered China. And, of course, then they went to live in China because they were occupying it. But their identity survived, and you have to think of how did it survive? You're supposed to think of them being at home and speaking these languages and doing all kind of shamanic things, and and then when the empire falls away, here's the Manchus as somehow this coherent group. Like they were before the empire, right? This is what you're supposed to kind of think. Now, in fact, what we know about this is that this name Manchus was used as a part of the state building of on the edge of the Ming Empire, where the early rulers of the Qing were kind of putting the whole thing together. This was an important part of their state building, to actually come up with this name that they were going to give to their followers. Now, people normally think that what happened was the name of another group got changed to Manchu. But in fact, the population living there was already so diverse and already so kind of, there were these spectra of language use and religious affiliation and, what people did for a living. People were on the spectrum, and it wasn't really just monolithic group. So it wasn't, I don't think, really a matter of changing one group's name to another. This was a name that, as an aspect of state building, was given to this population, which was a military population. Okay, so we go to China, conquer China, and we distribute Manchus all over China for purposes of occupation, right? They're kind of like policemen. They're kind of like the National Guard, and there they are. They live
Forgive
in
me.
these
What time period are we talking about here?
17th, 18th, 19th centuries. Now, the court realizes, okay, we took these people, we distributed them all over China. What happens when you migrate, right? When you move somewhere where you're the minority and they're the majority, well, you start talking like them, you start eating like them, right?
Yes.
You start doing what they do for fun and so on. The emperors don't want this because all the occupiers will disappear, they evaporate. There would be this. So they're insisting, speak this language, read this language. This is your language, right? Now, while the court is saying this is your language, this is your language, actually, all these occupiers are learning to speak the local Chinese dialect, and, this is not their language. So the court has to say, how can we make it come true that this will be their language? So the court becomes a sponsor of language standardization. The emperor himself is sitting there correcting, when they send little reports to him or requests, and they have to write in Manchu language, which is usually not their own language. And then he corrects it, red ink actually, and sends it back to them and makes them correct it, send it back in. So no dialect words, no grammatical errors. You're going to get this note from the emperor, and maybe a little bit of your pay docked for a little while. The court is publishing what you need to study the language. The primers, at the same time, the court is making the language very standard, and in fact sort of imposing a kind of basic English kind of rules on it. Here's the outcome of this. Today, people like me who study this period in history, we have a very easy time of it, because the emperor wanted the Manchus to learn the Manchu language, and he was determined to make it possible for them to do that no matter what. So today, we can study the Manchu language exactly as the Manchus did in the 19th century, and we've got all of the tools for that we need, right? In the meantime, languages are dying all over the world because nobody ever wrote them down. Nobody ever standardized them. And it is also true that there weren't as many Mongols. It wasn't as urgent a thing to do the same thing for the Mongolian language. And so today, although Mongolian script and Manchu script are very close together, Mongolian is a very difficult language to learn because it never got subjected to this ideological program, right, of standardization. And so it's kind of, modern standard Arabic in some ways is a little bit similar because Arabic has been so important as a medium of instruction and communication between Muslim communities, which are probably the most widely dispersed across the world. And everybody's got their little language. But in order to keep the community together, they've got standardized Arabic that again, can be learnt, right, by other people. So, these are some of the effects, and it's kind of a funny and ironic one in my own field that the emperor was trying to, impose this kind of, demand upon his army. And as a consequence, people like me today, we have a very easy time learning the language.
That's really fascinating. And I assume that this would be part of it. Did they make it, did they attach moral language to learning the language correctly?
Moral language in the sense of what?
Like good and evil, it reflected on your character as a person.
Yeah, to me, probably the most critical thing was the ability to convey political values, right? So loyalty to the emperor and what makes a good emperor, and what are the highest ideals, right? You have to have a peaceful society, prosperous society, and all. Being able to express all of that in a very standardized way. And in the case of that empire, because it was multilingual, these expressions connected to value had to be something that would translate really well across all three of the languages. And if they didn't, that's where the court would be stepping in and making sure there's a lot of publishing going on to get people to understand these terms as equivalent to each other. And things like this happened also in the other multilingual empires.
It's really fascinating. And I kind of want to apologize because I understand some of it, and you've done a great job of this, is you've dug into Chinese history, and I basically asked you to summarize 5,000 years of history in an hour, which is just a ridiculous request. So I appreciate your patience.
Yeah.
But there were a couple things, especially as we face more modern and contemporary problems, that I wanted to ask about. What do people need to understand in order, and that would best help them understand the Chinese and Japanese relationship?
Chinese and Japanese. My goodness. Well, I mean, China has a much longer documented history, as we all know. I wouldn't personally say 5,000 years, but that's okay. The official line of the Xi Jinping government is 7,000 years.
Okay.
Because that would predate the Egyptians, and
right.
That's really important. There's no evidence that anything that we would recognize as China was going on 7,000 years ago, but that's the line. To me, 3,500 years about right. But in the case of Japan, it's the first documentation, the kind of narrative, right, relating to Japan actually comes from Chinese documents of the 3rd century. So let's say it doesn't go back further than that. I'm not a specialist on Japan, but I've studied a lot of Japanese history. I did teach it very briefly. And, there's this idea that has been partly promoted by China that, well, the thing about Japan is they never really had their own culture, and all they did was just kind of glom onto these things from China, and maybe in some cases change them a little bit, but they didn't come up with anything of their own. That's actually not true, and the distribution across East Asia, not just Japan, but also Korea, Vietnam, and so on, of things like the writing system that clearly has its origins in China, the political philosophy, particularly social hierarchies, that also probably has its origins in China, certain kinds of technologies. That is true. Those things move all across the continent, and they moved into these other countries. And I think a lot of it had to do with prestige of the kind of rulership that was introduced in China in the 3rd century BCE. But it's limited, right? So in the case of Japan never centralized before the end of the 19th century. It never centralized in the way that China did at times. At times, China is very centralized. At other times, it's totally fragmented. Japan was always pretty much fragmented. The role of the aristocracy was continuously important in Japan. It was in China. It would rise and fall depending what kind of dynasty we're talking about. I think in Japan there was a very small elite lived with this consciousness that the important things for us are coming from China in terms of the things that give us prestige. We know how to use Chinese characters that came from China. That makes us prestigious in Japan. Buddhism did not come to Japan from China. It came from Korea, but it's associated with the mainland. And again, it's something that we brought it in. It gives us prestige here, but it came from over there. But at the point at which these importations would impinge upon the basics of social organization in Japan, or certain kinds of very strong elements of the folk religion, which much later was called Shinto, right? That's the point at which these things are not, these importations lose their power. So I think, Japan has always had a very distinctive identity. for me, the critical thing in doing modern history is that in the 19th century, when Japan had this amazing period in the Meiji Restoration, right? I mean, just these incredible men putting this all together, and Japan then gets onto this, really astounding trajectory of mechanization and militarization, and that's the point at which it becomes a threat to China. And in fact, by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, Japan is actually the most important impediment to China's continued independence and prosperity. That's how important Japan came to be in a very short period of time. And I think this is a difficult thing, because when people tell you that period, they'll normally go on and on about imperialism, meaning European imperialism, and the Americans are supposed to be part of this and so on. But and imperialism, there was a kind of modified form of imperialism in China, but it was never as important as this rise of Japan and the Japanese determination to expand their control over the mainland, starting with Korea, but the ambition would be China, and all the way up to the Second World War, that persisted.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And today, even though the relations are very, very different, the Chinese government always takes advantage of any opportunity to remind Japan those horrible things that you did to us in the World War II, which were horrible. They were horrible.
Yes.
Yeah, and not all Japanese are willing to acknowledge that, but enough of them are that this is not something that one would, in a totally honest way, right, make the center of your discussion. It's historical.
And to be honest, some of that even came, that question kind of came from a place, I through my teen years grew up in Wisconsin. It's like 98% white. And then meeting and talking to, when I went to college, to Asian students, and discovering the animosity between different, Chinese and Japanese, Korean and Japanese, Korean and Chinese.
Yes.
And so just trying to understand the roots of that, because for them it's expressed, it was expressed very differently. It's not really a historical thing. They're like, we do not like Japanese people, or we do not like Chinese people, right?
Right.
So what are the and so I mean, you've mentioned some of it. Obviously, it's pretty easy to figure out World War II, but it became clear talking that it wasn't always just World War II. And I think what you said about it, that kind of level of competition, right? And that watching what for them would be considered a backwards country, for China to see what they would consider a backwards country all of a sudden accelerate so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, if you, I mean, just as a funny anecdote, I mean, when I was very young, and a guy of Chinese heritage, said to me, I said I was interested in studying Japanese language, and he said, "Oh, it's just a degenerate form of Chinese." And in fact, it turned out to be that this was this individual's attitude towards all of Japanese culture, all the Japanese people. They're just, this is, I don't know what can you do about these kind of attitudes. People seem to need them, right? So if you took them away from them, it probably wouldn't work, but, then what would they do? I mean, they'd leave them as this helpless kind of, flailing around person so some people need to have this sense of superiority, but there are attitudes in China that the Japanese, all they ever do is imitate things. So they imitated Chinese culture for a long time, and then they started imitating Western culture and blah, blah, blah. That's got absolutely nothing to do with history. Those are just attitudes that have come up in China. I think, but you said apart from World War II, but in fact, I'm not sure you can do that. I really think that it's the
Fair.
World War II experience that locks this in, right? So
Yes.
I mean, really, before the 19th century, China and Japan did not have a lot of direct contact. There was this war at the end of the 16th century over Korea, and it was a very, very bad war. But as a general thing, and the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan actually closed the country, right? So that they weren't allowed to go to China, get in any trouble. But of course, that's just a rule. That's nothing, right? So the Japanese were the pirates. They were, all over the place. So, but I think so. There were reasons to be contemptuous of the Japanese, right? As pirates, as imitators, but that's just the fuzzy folk ideas that people have. I think it's the World War II experience that is what's behind this animosity. And in Korea, particularly, Korea was subjected to a very brutal form of colonization, direct colonization by Japan, the whole country, right?
Yes.
Whereas in the case of China, little parts of it, but even though that was very, very brutal. So I think this is the problem. Japan went fascist in the 30s, and Japanese fascistic militarism attacked Korea and China. And these were, now we're talking about people's great-grandparents, but
right.
When I was in college, these were grandparents, right? In some cases, parents maybe who had come in at the end of World War II. So it was within living memory, right, that these things had happened. So it's convenient, right? Anytime you decide you have to hate on somebody, you can always recall those experiences from World War II. It's not only the Japanese who become the focus of this. There are certain other groups who also can get dragged into this depending on where you are in the world. But when you point out to people, this is almost 3/4 of a century ago, if it's useful, it's useful. People will stick with it.
Yeah, and that I think I think as we kind of wrap up here, I think you've drawn some interesting conclusions there for our listeners. What would you say is the biggest lesson that you've learned studying the history of China? And you mentioned a little bit of the history of Russia, but just studying the history of China, what's the biggest thing that has enriched your life?
Enriched my life. The biggest thing. You're getting really difficult now. There's so much, when you get close to, you get into, your studies of Chinese literature, culture, and so on. There's so much that is enriching. I think, Americans can very easily relate, I think, to this Chinese sense of self-sufficiency. Right. They were on their own for a long time. The empires basically worked like this. We make you pay your taxes once a year, but other than that, you take care of these things. So families, extended families, little villages, they were doing it themselves. And when the Chinese became migrants, right, to other countries, this same self-sufficiency, nobody's going to do this for me. I'm going to have to do this. I think Americans really relate to that when they deal with Chinese on a personal basis, and I think Chinese relate to this in Americans when they find it. This sense that I'm going to take care of this. Nobody else is going to do this for me. I'm going to do this. So I think that this resiliency, this sense of initiative, this sense of self-sufficiency is what's at the bottom of what we call Chinese culture. But it's at the bottom of a lot of cultures. So then you relate to that.
Thank you. And I don't want to miss this opportunity to ask you, because I think this is something that you hit on quite a bit, the word inevitability, and how we think things are inevitable, but they really aren't.
Right.
Do you think there's a lesson for our audience, both in how they look at history and how they look at themselves, things that they assume are inevitable but really aren't?
Well, I think what history does show you is nothing is actually inevitable. I mean, we're talking partly about a mental habit of historians, which is they want to tell you nothing's inevitable, and we don't want to do the teleology thing. We want to go back to the point when everything was possible, right? But in the 21st century, we tend to think in terms of quantum mechanics, right? And so what we're really talking about are these collapsing wave functions, right? As we're going. So before the collapse of the wave function, in the period of superpositioning, everything is possible. But once the wave function has collapsed, then it is what it is. Yes, I don't think... we talked about this. I talked about this recently on another podcast, but I'll just be very brief. One time, to try to get this across to my students about causality, I had this card trick that's actually, I didn't tell them, it's based on an algorithm. And what you do is you try to get this other person to think that you're reading their mind, because you go through a sequence of cards, and they are supposedly the ones who only they know where they started, and then each number of the card determines the next one and so on. And only they know what card they finish with. But in fact, when you're following along, all you have to do is every sort of 5 cards, it doesn't matter where you start, the chances are 4 out of 5, you'll end up on the same card that they will. Now, to me, this is causality. This is, there's nothing about these cards, any of these cards, that is determinative in itself. But their position in relation to each other and their relationship to the overall size of the deck and so on. So to me, what it suggests is that overall, the chances are something, maybe not 4 out of 5. You'd have to scale it up to the universe, right, from a card of 52. but there's some chance, some likelihood that things are going to be more or less the way they are no matter what. So I think it's a nice antidote to the people who say everything is contingent, and it's like one little decision made by this person here, there, the other place is somehow or other going to change history. I think the chances are, let's say, 20% that it might, but the chances are 80% that it won't. On this inevitability thing, I mean, that's more or less what I would come out. Think in terms of superpositioning and then collapsing wave functions, and we'll probably be about where we should be.
I like that, because there are those chances for these radical kind of changes, and sometimes those radical changes look radical, but they aren't, right? They were buried in the patterns all along. But there are chances for change, but we have to also just reconcile ourselves to a lot of things are what they are. And I think that's or they will be what they will be.
Well, even after I make this demonstration for the students, I say, I haven't told you anything because you don't know what is in the 20% and what is in the 80%. So always do the right thing, no matter what.
Yeah. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Dr. Crossley. It's been a real pleasure having you.
Very nice talking to you.